Good evening, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session of Global Reflections, a video series dedicated to discussing significant global developments, particularly in the fields of education and sociology. My name is Dr. Selçuk Aydın. I am an assistant professor at Boğaziçi University and coordinator of social research at Enstitü Sosyal. My research areas include state formation, social movements, and the Middle East and world politics, and also the intersection of the sociology and the international relations. This event is brought to you by Enstitü Sosyal, an Istanbul-based think tank focusing on education and sociology. Through global reflections, we aim to foster greater understanding of the global trends and challenges shaping societies worldwide. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Martin K. Whyte from Harvard University, a distinguished scholar in comparative sociology and an expert on China's sociology and demographic landscape. Professor Whyte's work has been instrumental in understanding the intersection of demographic policies, family structures, and social inequalities in China. And also his research are very much significant in the theoretical and methodological perspective in sociology. His latest research, Be Careful What You Wish For, China Confronts Population Decline, examines the implications of China's shift from the one-child policy to policies encouraging larger families. Shedding light on the societal and economic impacts of these demographic transformations, today we'll listen to this great research from Professor Whyte. First, we will hear Professor Whyte's presentation, followed by Q&A session where he will address audience questions. Professor Whyte.
I'm very pleased to be invited to speak to your Global Reflection series and to present my thoughts about the history of the strange history of population trends in China in the last 50 or so years. Before I get started in showing my slideshow for this Be Careful What You Wish For talk, let me try to put it in the broader context. If you go back 50 or 60 years, birth rates in most countries around the world were relatively high, and there was a huge amount of worry about the population explosion. In 1968, a Stanford professor named Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And there were a number of other reports and studies back then in the 60s and 70s talking about the danger of the very rapid population increase around the world and how that would outstrip the ability to feed people and to clothe them and so forth. This was influenced by theories that go back more than 200 years. Thomas Malthus, a British economic thinker, is famous for essentially saying that population would increase geometrically, whereas resources like food and clothing and so forth could only increase arithmetically, so there would be an inevitable tendency for a population to surpass that. So many countries around the world became very concerned about that, and China was centrally involved in that concern. But if you look at where we are today, the world is very different. There are more countries now that have below replacement level fertility than have above replacement level fertility. The main areas in which the population is still growing rapidly are in sub-Saharan Africa and a few places in the Middle East and so forth. But I went online and saw that even Turkey in recent years is below replacement level fertility since about 2015. The United States is also below replacement level fertility. But both Turkey and the United States today have much higher level fertility than China does. So how did China get to where it is? Now, there are two main parts of the story, and the one that is most familiar is the one-child policy. That unlike all the other countries around the world that tried to use voluntary family planning programs to encourage people and allow people to have fewer babies, in China, for more than 50 years, they made it mandatory that there be limits on births, and they coercively enforced this. But the other main contributor is the fact that China, after Mao died and starting in the late 1970s, began rapid economic growth, more rapid than any other country in the world, and rapid economic development depresses birth rates. So that's the story I'm going to be dealing with today. And let me see if I can. Okay, now you can see my application, but I'm having trouble changing the slide. Okay, so here's the general context. 2022 was a momentous turning point for China. The total population began to shrink, and China is no longer the most populous country in the world. India now has a larger population than China. So how did China get to this point? And is this an accomplishment that China should be proud of and take advantage of? Or is this a looming crisis? So I'm going to be considering today what the trend in fertility rates in China has been over the last more than 50 years. Why did China adopt the one-child policy in 1980? Why did they justify it? And that's where the be careful what you wish for comes in, that I'll explain in a moment. And did these mandatory birth limits play the key role in declining fertility since 1970? And then why did the CCP stands for the Chinese Communist Party, why did it end the one-child policy in 2016? Now they're trying to promote more births, but these are not generally effective. So why are they not? And what is the likely population trend in coming decades? And is this as I've already mentioned, an accomplishment or a looming crisis? Now, it's true today that China has almost 3 times the population that it did at the time of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, over 1.4 billion people. So that's more than 4 times as many people as there are in the United States, for instance. But it's not because Mao Zedong, who was the leader of China from 1949 until he died in 1976, because he wanted to have more and more births consistently. He had a very erratic shifting back and forth. And only in the period before 1980, though, there were several periods in which China ineffectively tried to have voluntary family planning limits on births, but they didn't work very well. Starting in 1970, so while Mao was still alive, a decade before the one-child policy was launched, China began to place mandatory limits on births. And it turns out that most of the reduction in fertility in China from 1970 up to today occurred before the one-child policy, as I'll show in charts in just a moment. So the enforcement of the one-child policy has not really been the main driver of China's very dramatic fertility decline. It's really much more China's extraordinarily rapid economic development. Now, I'll be mainly using a projection rather than a statistic called the total fertility rate. So I need to make clear that everybody understands what that means. It's not a statistic, it's a projection, an estimate of if women of various ages and situations had the same number of babies that they're having today, at the end of their reproductive life, how many babies would they have had? And replacement level fertility is 2.1, is considered to be 2.1. In other words, each woman on average would have to have slightly more than 2 births for the population to remain stable if there's no change over time. Okay, so here's a statement showing Mao's when he was in his pronatalist mode. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you could see he's very much saying he's rejecting Malthus, this British thinker that I mentioned, said that food cannot keep up with the population growth. But notice the date of this quote. This is September 1949. This is the month before the Chinese Communist Party took over the whole country. So before he was actually running the country, he said, no, population control is not a problem. This is a quote from 1957, and it shows a very different point of view. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But notice he's saying the government needs to have a special ministry of birth control, or a commission as part of the government. And during the 1960s, China created a state family planning commission that has played a key role, particularly later on in the one-child policy. So Mao went back and forth. He was not a consistent person in that and many other regards. The beginning of coercive family planning or mandatory birth limits was in the 1970s. It was the campaign is called Later, Longer, Fewer. So they tried to get people to wait until mid-20s before they got married. They had been legally allowed to marry for women starting at age 18 and men at age 20. But now they tried to get them to wait until mid-20s. If they were going to have more than one birth, a 4-year minimum spacing. And then the key factor is to have only 2 births for urban families or 3 births in rural families. And the State Family Planning Commission that had been created in the 1960s then gave out birth permits. They did menstrual monitoring. They had eventually more than 500 million grassroots family planning workers who went into different factories and neighborhoods and so forth. And they, among other things, kept card files on the reproductive behavior and contraceptive use and menstrual cycles even of women. They required IUDs. They forced abortions. They did a lot of the coercive things that became infamous in China after the one-child policy was launched were already being carried out during the 1970s. But this was very effective in bringing down the birth rate. The total fertility rate went from 5.8. In other words, at the rate of 1970, the average woman would end up with almost 6 births down to under 3, 2.7, 2.8. This I'm going to show this slide a couple of times in the talk because it's very important to emphasize. If you look at the chart, you can see during the early years of the revolution, the total fertility rate was around 6. There was a huge famine that was created by this Great Leap Forward campaign of Mao that actually depressed fertility. But this was not planned, that the government wasn't trying to get people to have fewer babies. It was because large numbers of people were starving and dying from 1959 to 1961. And then right after that, there was a huge baby boom. Total fertility went up to over 7. But then starting in 1970, you can see this is the most dramatic decline in the fertility rate. During the 1970s, the one-child policy was only launched here. And after the one-child policy was launched, the fertility rate actually went up a little for a while, and it would only resumed its decline in the latter part of the 1980s. This blue line here is the replacement level fertility, 2.1. So since the early 1990s, China has had consistently sub-replacement level fertility. And so if China had already reduced its fertility rate so dramatically during the 1970s, why did they launch the one-child policy, which made it even stricter? Instead of limits of 2 or 3 children, they wanted to have everybody have no more than 1 child. And that's really a strange puzzle because, in fact, there was no need to do that. And it was a very harmful policy in many ways. But because they had been so successful up until then, the Chinese Communist Party decided, well, if we can have fewer babies with this 2 and 3 child policy limit, well, let's go down to 1 child policy. Now, at the time, the Chinese demographers were trying to develop their advice on population policy. And a man by the name of Sun Jian, who became a high official, who was actually trained as a rocket scientist and had computers, and he'd visited Europe earlier, and he'd been exposed to some of these Malthusian thinking about population getting out of control. A study published, The Limits of Growth, conveyed this Malthusian idea. And he was very influenced by that. And he joined the PRC demographers in debating birth limits. And he eventually, partly because he had computers, rocket scientists, you have computers. The demographers only had abacuses and hand calculators. They couldn't compete with Sun Jian. But for some reason, Sun Jian also proclaimed that the ideal population for China 100 years into the future, in other words, by 2080, was 650 to 700 million people. Now, this is at a time when China already was approaching 1 billion people. So be careful what you wish for. He was actually saying China needs to not only slow population growth, but it needs to reverse it and have fewer people at the end of the next 100 years than China has right now in the 1970s. And his thinking, he didn't create the one-child policy, but he very much favored the one-child policy, and he provided this pseudoscientific, what I call quackery, because there's no basis for saying, oh, China's ideal population is 650 to 700 million in 2080. It came out of the blue, but nonetheless, he got a lot of people believing it. And many other demographers criticized him, and they disagreed. They said that there would be rapid aging, there would be harm to families, it'd be very difficult to coerce people to have only one child. But basically, the policy went into effect in 1980 nationally, and it lasted for 35 years after that. This is Mr. Sung Jen. He's still alive, so far as I know. He's well into his 90s, but he was a consistent champion providing rationale for the one-child policy. Here's one of the common propaganda posters. What this says at the bottom in Chinese is, for the four modernizations of our country, one couple should only give birth to one child. And it began to be even influential outside of China. This was from a British magazine in 2009. The whole world needs to adopt China's one-child policy. Well, what have been the fertility trends in the one-child era? I mentioned already from showing that chart that fertility actually increased for a few years after the policy was implemented for complicated reasons I won't go into now. But then it resumed its decline later in the 1980s, reached replacement level fertility and below in the early 1990s. And for most of the years up until 2015, the general estimates were that China's total fertility rate was 1.4 to 1.6. So it was quite low, but not as low as it has become since then. But my argument here is that it was mainly driven by the fact that China had such rapid economic development. The United Nations Population Conference back in the 1970s developed the slogan, "Development is the best contraceptive." In other words, rather than trying to have propaganda for, oh, you should have fewer children and distribute free contraceptives or whatever, you should simply develop the economy rapidly and have many people leave agriculture, farming. In farming, it makes sense to have more labor power in your family farm and go into the cities and compete in the schools and to get good urban jobs and so forth, and get more and more women educated and not wanting to be burdened by lots of babies. The development will rapidly depress your fertility rate. And it turns out that all of the other East Asian societies, in addition to China, also have ultra-low fertility levels today without having done anything like China's one-child policy. So they did not have this intensive coercion, but they're more developed than China. So here's the chart again, just to remind you again, the fact that fertility mainly fell most sharply in the 1970s, and that it initially, when the policy was launched, increased and fluctuated before it began to go down after that. Now here are comparative figures on East Asian ultra-low fertility levels. So you see, this is from the census of China in 2020.
So, Professor White,
yes.
If I don't interrupt, I want to ask you, if China wouldn't apply one-child policy, still China's birth rate is going to decrease or not? What do you think, based on the chart?
Its economic growth rate or its birth rate?
Birth rate.
The birth rate would have gone down anyway, but China, you could say China's leaders wouldn't have known that, because in the 1970s, they didn't know how rapidly they were going to be able to make the economy grow. But all of these countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, had very rapid economic growth, China even more so. And it was the economic growth. But China, as you see, all of these other countries have are richer. They have a higher GDP per capita than China, but China's fertility rate in 2020 is actually below Japan's. But the champion is South Korea. I think more recently, South Korea is about 0.72. So in South Korea, they're very worried about the fact that, even more worried than in China, that people are not marrying and having babies. But China, they're increasingly worried about that. So mandatory birth rate limits started 45 years ago with a later, longer, fewer policy, and then the one-child limit was enforced for 35 years. But already, starting around the turn of the millennium, around 2000, about 24 Chinese demographers were so upset about the trends and how they worried about the future, they began conducting pilot research and drafting position papers trying to encourage the Chinese Communist Party to lift the one-child policy. They said, among other things, there are going to be not only rapid aging, but sex ratio imbalances. So that it's estimated that there are more than 30 million or more excess males because of complicated, Chinese preferences and selective abortions of female fetuses and so forth. So a lot of problems created by the one-child policy. But 2 appeals were sent up to the Chinese Communist Party leadership in 2004 and 2009. But my understanding from one of my former students, who was one of these demographers, is that Sung Jen came out of retirement to demand that they hold the line and not stop the one-child policy. And it was only in 2015 that it was finally ended. So as I mentioned, in 2016, all Chinese are allowed to have 2 children. Then in 2021, that was raised to 3 children. But there was much popular mocking of that because obviously people were having many fewer children. So the idea that you are now allowed to have 3 children, why have any limits at all if you're trying to encourage births? But in fact of the matter is there have been fewer births each year after 2016. The number of births last year in 2023 was only slightly more than 9 million, the fewest ever, barely more than half the total of 2016, the year the one-child policy was lifted. So this trend downward shows that the one-child policy was not the main driver suppressing the birth rate, okay? And in fact, I mentioned in the earlier chart that the estimate in the census of 2020 is China's total fertility rate is 1.3, but their estimates for 2022, I don't have a 2023 estimate, that it's down very close to 1, okay? So maybe even lower than Taiwan, although not as low as South Korea. So let's see, you can't see the end of this chart, but basically you can see it goes from, this almost 18 million births in 2016 down to, well, I mentioned that 2023 was only 9 million. So what has the Chinese Communist Party been doing to try to get people to boost the number of births? Well, the people, as I mentioned, are allowed to have 3 children now. Then they've increased the paid maternity leave. They've given cash bonuses in some localities for 2nd and 3rd births. They extend the wedding leave, when you have paid leave after you get married, from 3 days to 30 days in some places. They're trying to guarantee placement in expanded preschools. The province of Sichuan has said people can have as many babies as they want, and they've encouraged even unwed young women to have babies, which is not a general option in China. So, and one of the bizarre trends is this one here, next to last. The State Family Planning Association, I mentioned there were 500 500,000 grassroots family planning workers that were enforcing the previous limits on births. Now they're supposed to be retrained and to get people to get married and have more babies. So the same people who told you stop having babies are now telling you, go, have more babies. Very strange. And they're also doing things like trying to discourage people from getting abortions and trying to discourage people from getting divorced. They introduced in 2020 a 30-day cooling off period. So if you and your spouse want to get divorced, or you or your spouse want to get divorced, you have to file papers, but you have to wait at least 30 days. The idea is you'll cool down and you'll forget about it maybe. And here is, I showed the poster earlier from the one-child policy. This is Wuhan, the Yangtze River going through Wuhan, the city in central China. And here you see a sculpture showing the happy family with 3 children. But it doesn't.
Professor White.
Yeah.
I also interest very much about the cultural roots of the kids. Because in Turkish culture or the Western cultures, we can speak about the religion. And can you a bit explain about the Confucianism about the child?
Well, Confucianism, I don't know how much you wanted me to go into. Confucianism is a very complicated philosophical, going back more than 2 millennia, but part of Confucianism is there is a very clear male bias. So there is a preference for male children. Okay, so, and that particularly has been an issue in enforcing the one-child policy in the Chinese countryside, because there's not a cultural feature, but a social practice that in rural villages, when a young woman got married, in almost all cases, she moved out of her parents' home and into her husband's village and home. So parents who only had daughters would be left in their old age with no grown child at home to support and care for them. Okay, so there was a male bias in favor of males, but reinforced by hard-headed economics that if you had one son, or better, 1 or 2 sons, you could rely on them in the rural areas in old age to help support you in your old age. And until very recently, there were no government pensions or anything in rural China. Even today, they're still minuscule. But if you only had daughters, it was like you didn't have children at all. I should make it clear there's a big difference between rural and urban China. In urban China, for these things that I've just been discussing since the 1950s have not been the case. So if you have daughters in urban China, you could count on them to help support you in your old age, even when they've married out. But in rural China, it's different, okay? And there is a popular feeling that sons should be responsible mainly for supporting their parents in old age, but daughters are likely to be more caring for you. So it's kind of, they may not have the main responsibility, but you're sort of more emotionally dependent upon them. And this is a common feature, maybe in Turkish society as well. It's certainly in American society that women are seen as more connected to their parents and more and so forth. And sons may have financial responsibility, but they're not so good at, maintaining family ties as women are. So, but anyway, let me just go on a little further. Basically, no sign that these various birth incentives that the Chinese Communist Party is trying are reversing the fertility decline, which still seems to be underway. And China seems to be ignoring the fact that the other East Asian countries have gotten to very low birth rates, and Japan and South Korea and Singapore, et cetera, those governments have all tried similar kinds of things about, more daycare centers and longer maternity leaves and, financial bonuses for having more babies and so forth, but they have not really worked around the world. So it turns out it's much more easy if you're an authoritarian government to get people to have fewer babies, but it's very hard for even an authoritarian government to get people to have more babies. And China is not going to be able to. China has now started in 2022, as I mentioned at the beginning, long-term population decline. And I don't think that Sun Jian will get his wish. Be careful what you wish for. 2080, China's probably still going to have more than 700 million people. But it could be early in the next century, China will fall in terms of population to the level that Sun Jian thought was optimal, even though he had no scientific basis for that. But nonetheless, the Chinese Communist leadership still says, oh, we're going to turn this around. We're a powerful government. So here's a quote from Xi Jinping in the Chinese Communist Congress held just in 2022. But basically, again, this is saying that these policies in various countries around the world have not worked. So is population decline a crisis? Well, some aspects of it are good, okay? So there's less pollution, fewer Chinese, reduced crowding and pressure on resources. It's easier to feed, house, and educate smaller birth cohorts. But the problem is that China is also aging more rapidly than any other country due to both rapid economic development and its mandatory birth limits. So China is growing old before it's getting rich. It's having to cope with the needs of rapidly growing elderly population without having developed sufficient institutions and resources to provide for the needs of the elderly and replace the kind of care and support that they got from their children, and now it's mostly just one child. The number of new entrants to the labor force has already been declining since about 2010. So pension contributions and taxes and so forth to support the elderly have already been endangered. But it's also the fact that so many aging Chinese don't have many grown children to support them the way they used to. Here's a cartoon that shows the one-child policy at the bottom and the struggling parents and the struggling grandparents. These are some demographic charts. I won't go into them in detail, but this yellow line here is the dependency ratio. And China, in its early economic development, rapid economic development, enjoyed a demographic dividend. In other words, the percentage of the population that was in the labor force and was producing value and helping support both the very old and the very young who were dependents was shrinking. But since, for a decade or more, the dependency ratio has been going up sharply. So there are various ways to convey this. This is one other way. The United Nations calculation back in 2007 of how many working age adults are there for every elderly Chinese to be supported, and it's close to 8 to begin with, and it's in recent times it's down to about 3, and it's projected to go even lower than that. Here's another dramatic illustration. In general, poorer, developing, still partially agrarian countries have younger populations and smaller proportions of the elderly. But China, as of now, has surpassed the United States and the average age of its population. So China is still much poorer than the United States in terms of economic development, but it's already an older society. And these are some figures that I won't go into in detail from an academic study that this slide cites at the bottom, but it's simply giving projections about if the amount of money to be spent on education, healthcare, and pensions is already rising dramatically, and it'll be higher than the percentage of total government expenditures compared to GDP currently, unless China finds some magical way to deal with it. Back in 1994, so we're talking a long time ago, 30 years ago, I did a survey in a city of Baoding in central China. It's below Beijing. It's an ordinary middle-level city, but we interviewed older people, and we interviewed their one grown child, that each older person we interviewed. And at the time in 1994, the average of the elderly respondents had an average of 3.1 grown children to support them, because they had completed their childbearing before the one-child policy and before the dramatic decline for other reasons. But now, in recent times, most urban elderly have only one grown child to support them, as that cartoon I showed earlier showed. and a minority of urban elderly will outlive their only child. One estimate is that maybe 15% of Chinese women in their 80s will have a child that has died before they will die. In rural China, it's more likely that rural families have 2 or 3 children rather than just one. But many of those children are off working in the cities in migrant labor, and many of the rural elderly are burdened with raising left behind children because migrants have a hard time getting their children into urban public schools. They often, and they have to work very long hours, a very competitive environment, they often send their children back to be cared for by the grandparents. So for elderly people in China today, their life is less secure than they were 30 years ago, is my argument here. So China cannot avoid long-term population decline. Efforts to boost births will not work. So China would do better to invest in the welfare and human capital of the population it does have and combat gender inequality. It's much more on the crisis side, although there are things China can do to try to lessen the future crisis. But nonetheless, their efforts to get people to have more babies do not seem to be working. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, contribution to understand this significant transformation of China, and also which is, as I said, very much related to other nations. And thank you for contribution to Enstitü Sosyal.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.